To borrow from Fareed Zakaria, today we live in a democratic age. Over the last century, the world has been shaped by one major trend among all others, and that is the rise of democracy. If you really think about it, in 1900, not a single country had what we would call or consider a democracy, a government that was created by elections in which every adult citizen could vote. Today, over 117 countries have a nominal democracy, perhaps not fully liberal, perhaps not fully electoral, but 117 countries in the world today. What was once a peculiar practice of a handful of states in North America and in the North Atlantic has become the standard form of government for all mankind. We live in a democratic age also in a much broader sense. From the Greek root demos, or people, democracy means the rule of the people. The Arab Spring, the Velvet Revolution in the Soviet Union, the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. We are witnessing, and of course the most recent sort of upheavals in the Arab world, we are witnessing an attempt that is to shift power downward from governments to people and throughout society and throughout ethnic groups. And the US has been at the forefront of this change. Since the early days of the Bush administration, democracy promotion has been an explicit foreign policy. Along with defense and security, democracy promotion has been considered the major sort of objective in terms of foreign. And the Obama administration has continued this goal. The National Security Strategy of 2010 says, the United States believes certain values are universal and will work to promote them worldwide. These include an individual's freedom to speak their mind, assemble without fear, worship as they please, and choose their own leaders. They also include dignity, tolerance, and equality among all people, and the fair and equitable administration of justice. The U.S. was founded upon those beliefs and values, and the U.S. is seeking to promote these values overseas. So today, to discuss those efforts and to discuss the success of those efforts and to analyze them, we have Jerry Hyman. Jerry is the Senior Advisor and President of the Hills Program on Governance at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He provides assistance and advice to Hills-affiliated governance networks and centers in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and he manages the Hills Program in the U.S. He conducts research on democracy and governance and advises the U.S. government as well. Jerry is a member of the Advisory Council to the Center for International Media Citizens for the National Endowment for Democracy, and previously, and sort of where our association began, he was director of the U.S. government's Agency for International Development, Office of Democracy and Governance, where we basically sought to provide aid to about 60, 70 countries overseas in this area. He's practiced law at Covington and Burlington, but he's also been a professor and is by training both a lawyer and has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. So he understands both the anthropological side and the law side. He's the author of a cabinet-level development agency, Right Problem, Wrong Solution, and as far as one of the most outstanding experts, I think, in Washington on democracy and governance. So I'd like you to welcome Jerry Hyman.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Merrill, for inviting me today, and for you to be missing your lunch in coming here instead. So I know what that means. There'll be sandwiches for you outside, I understand, afterwards. I was, as Professor Merrill said, this is an age of democracy, and democracy has exploded really around the world. But there has also been a backlash against democracy and democracy promotion. And I understand that some of the roots of it are right here on this campus. President Samuelson said to me this morning that there are potentially major riots about democracy promotion in the United States right here at BYU, and which is, of course, known for its major riots and demonstrations. Could I come today and, calm the cougars down? So that's what I hope to do a bit by confronting really four questions really head on. The first is, why should the United States provide democracy assistance? Why should it do it at all? especially since it involves such sensitive areas and such engagement in the sensitive areas of other countries than our own and in their domestic politics. Second, are we imposing our values on other countries? Is this a kind of cultural imperialism? Why are we pushing democracy on other countries? The third is, are we hypocritical by supporting democracy on the one hand and dealing with authoritarian governments on the other, and autocratic regimes as well? And on the other, and also, what about failing to assist countries that have become somewhat democratic because we don't like their policies? And the most obvious example of that is the election of Hamas in Gaza, but may well be as well evident in Egypt, depending upon what happens to the political dynamics in Egypt. So on the one hand, we want to promote democracy. On the other hand, we say, well, we're not going to assist you if we don't like you. So is it hypocritical? And then finally, are we at all effective in doing any of this? So the first question, I think those are the four that are animating all of this, rabble-rousing here on campus. But there's plenty of time for discussion afterwards, so please, whatever questions you've got. So the first question is, why do we do democracy and governance at all? And I think there are two reasons to do it. And one reason is why it's embedded where it is, at least the major part of it, and that is in the U.S. Agency for International Development. So the first reason is that we have values. It is part of our foreign policy is designed to support our purposes and our interests. And among our interests and among our purposes are the expansion of freedom. We perhaps have more latitude than some smaller countries to pursue our values, and not just our material interests and not just our security interests, which drive the foreign policies of smaller countries than ours. And so we have, in a way, a luxury that they don't have, although they also pursue their values in their foreign policy. So foreign policy is partly a function of what the values of a country are. And to a lesser extent, every country pursues its values in its foreign policy. And one of our values, I think, is the extension of freedom. It's what we are founded on. It's what ties us together. If you ask us, what's an American? If you ask a Japanese, what's a Japanese? You can go back to the 7th century. You know, it's blood, kin, and so on and so forth, history. If you ask an American, what's an American? I think you probably have to reply that it's a willingness to accept the constitutional framework of our country. I mean, that's who we are. We're a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of different places that are tied together by a sense of values and procedures that are embedded in a variety of our founding declarations, including, of course, most obviously, the Constitution. So the extension of freedom, or the grounding of freedom, has been a central American value since the Revolution, and it remains so today. So part of the reason we do this, I think, is because of who we are, what we want to stand for, what we want to be in the world, what we hope to achieve in the world, and how we think the world ought best to be patterned, quite apart from or in addition to, I should say, our security interests and our material interests and oil and resources and so on, all of which are there, but so are our values, and our values include the rule of law, inclusion, freedom of speech, religion, and so on and so forth, and you all know all of that. I guess another way of looking at that is whether we would prefer the alternative, which we were in danger of when you were quite young and maybe even not quite born yet, during the Soviet period. Soviet expansionism in a world of military regimes, of communist regimes, of a variety of autocratic regimes, left, as Professor Merrill said, very few democratic, free countries. Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, but only after the coup leaders were displaced. So the world looked pretty stark, pretty bleak. If you asked yourself, or if you looked at the world and said to yourself, where are our security interests? You're surrounded by countries that are very different from you, that have different purposes, different agendas, and different ways of dealing with their own populations and with other countries. So part of our reason for doing this is our values, and part of us has to do with our own security interests. A second set of reasons for doing this has to do with the reason I think many of you are here, and that is development. Democracy and governance was not part of the development bundle in a coherent way until about 1990, when the Warsaw Pact began to fall apart in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. But there were stirrings of it before that. And again, there were two reasons to do it, one of which was our values. But the second reason had to do with the extent to which development goals were impeded by the political structure of the countries in which those development goals were being pursued. And the reason for that is pretty obvious if you think about it. Corruption, nepotism, bureaucratic inertia, all kinds of personalistic reasons, personalistic interests, stood in the way of countries adopting the kind of economic policies and even the kind of health and education policies that were, we thought, everyone thought, required to get sustainable development. Why? Because it enhanced the interests of groups and individuals who were not part of the central government and who hadn't gotten there through closed political parties, nepotism, patronage, and things like that. And so the argument was that if you didn't address these kinds of issues, if you didn't address the political side of development, you were going to miss a large part not only of the development complex, what kind of a country did this want to become, but also what kinds of policies were these governments going to pursue. So some weeks ago, for example, the chief economist of the World Bank gave a talk about what he called the new paradigm. And it was entirely in economic terms, as if the IMF and the bank and the G20 adopted some policies that said you should open your markets because it would be better for you, automatically everybody would just sort of say, aha, we should open our markets. But what stands in the way of that often are the political interests of the people who want the markets closed, and the payoffs to the government officials and to the cronies and to all kinds of other people to keep those markets closed. But there was not a word of the political side of this dimension in this chief economist's discussion. So the national security strategy of 2010 that Professor Merrill referred to, and also the one of 2002 and 2006, reconfigured our conception, or at least proposed to reconfigure our conception of the national security of the United States along three elements of a stool, which was the then favorite and still favorite paradigm: defense, diplomacy, and development. And this was true in the Bush 43 administration, and it was carried over into the Obama administration, as Professor Merrill suggested. So the development part of that national security agenda and the development agenda itself inherently involved political elements, political dimensions that were best addressed in a democratic environment. How would you create transparent, accountable governments if you don't have a democratic system? What is the alternative if you want accountable governance? And if you don't have accountable governance, you get this perverse alternative, which are patrimonial, nepotistic, etc., that stand in the way not only of the economic development, but of health and education and a whole variety of other things because of the payoffs that come to the political parties or the individuals. So to give you a little vignette as well, In the early 1990s, when we were first creating this approach, we invited the legal advisor to the World Bank to a small meeting of about 6 or 7 of us that were trying to think about how to do this work at AID. And the first of those meetings, it was just an ad hoc group, and we didn't want to create a bureaucratic organization out of it. So the first of these meetings with these 7 or 8 people took place at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. And from then on, it was just called the Tuesday Group. So we met on Tuesdays from time to time. We got together and discussed. We invited other people, including the legal counsel for the World Bank. And he came over and, in no uncertain terms, announced flat out that the things we were thinking about, elections and political processes, fair elections and fair political processes, the rule of law, the engagement of communities and citizens through civil society organizations, and good governance, all of them were categorically off the table for the World Bank. The World Bank, the mission of the World Bank is to reduce poverty, he announced. It's very clear, it's in all their statement, carved in stone in the building. And secondly, it has a charter provision that says it shall not engage in the internal affairs of its members, political affairs of its member states. It's in the charter of the bank. Therefore, he said, in no possible way could any of the things we were thinking about ever be part of the World Bank program. Less than 10 years later, with the exception of the assistance to political parties and elections, every other element is deeply encoded into the World Bank's programs. Now, this is an organization explicitly devoted to poverty reduction. And they've come to the conclusion that there is no way to do that without the rule of law, without civic participation, without accountable, transparent governance. You can't get there from here if you don't have those things. They still do not use the D word because of the charter and because of some of the opposition of some of their member states who are not fully democratic, obviously. But they do all of the programs that AID has done and that the other democracy-promoting agencies, international agencies like the EU and its member states do. But they do it under rule of law, good governance, civic participation, gender, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those are all the elements of the democracy and governance program amongst the donors that promote democracy and governance, with the exception of fair elections and political party work. So the bank does it because it couldn't find a better way, couldn't find a different way to get to its own poverty reduction goals than to include, not to be dominated by, but at least to include these elements of democracy and governance that are in our democracy and governance programs. So the reason to do it, our values are there, and because we have other goals, development goals, that also will create a better, more secure world. I mean, all you have to do is listen to the Secretary of State. Almost every speech is about that. You can't do that very easily without including these elements. Second, isn't this cultural imperialism? What happened to the principles of Westphalia? I don't know how many of you are IR majors, but I hope you Principles of Westphalia. Westphalia was a treaty that the European principalities, really not even countries, signed in 1648 that said that they would not intrude, this was after the 30 years war of religion between Catholics and Protestants, they agreed that they would not go to war with one another over internal matters. So the Protestants wouldn't engage in war against Catholic principalities wouldn't engage against war against Protestant municipalities on the ground of religion. And the flip side was that they would not also persecute people within their own principalities because of their religious beliefs. So that's the Treaty of Westphalia, and it encodes the principle of sovereignty that you hear quite a lot today. We should not engage in internal domestic affairs of other sovereign entities. So what happened to that? Isn't that around? Well, a couple things happened to it. World War I happened to it. World War II happened to it. The World Bank, the Charter, the UN. More important perhaps than any of them, the globalization of markets, the movement of capital, the movement of labor, the movement of businesses across. We used to have a requirement at AID that you had to, quote, buy American. And that meant you had to buy, unless for a variety of specified reasons you couldn't, you had to buy American products. Okay, so Chrysler Corporation was an American car, obviously, along with Chrysler's cars were American, Ford were American, GM were American, but Mercedes-Benz bought Chrysler. Okay, so was Chrysler now a German company or was it an American company? And not only that, but its engines were made in Mexico, its brakes were made in Canada, the transistors were made in Hong Kong. So what constituted an American car, you might ask? The globalization of the marketplace has eroded these countries in the principalities that agreed in Westphalia made all the stuff that they consumed internally for the most part. Sure, there was trade in pepper. Sure, there was trade in spice. Yes, there were, glass vases that went up from Venice, but you didn't survive on glass vases from Venice or pepper from Java. You survived on what you produced. All these principalities were self-sufficient. Well, there's nobody that's self-sufficient anymore. So the Westphalian boundaries have really collapsed for economic and for macro global institutional purposes. But more importantly, that's an excuse, you might say. Assistance is inherently engaged in changing the domestic political structures of the countries that accept the assistance. If it weren't, you wouldn't have to have assistance. Assistance is designed precisely to change the status quo into something else. That's its purpose, to get economic growth, to create macroeconomic systems or policies that will enhance economic growth and more equality of income and a whole variety of other Millennium Development Goals, if you know what those are, that the UN came up with, or under a UN conference, countries came up with about a decade ago. So where there is assistance to the achievement of these MDGs, of these Millennium Development Goals, or any other assistant goals, they all involve a change in the domestic structures and the domestic policies of the countries they are designed to assist. Perhaps we can get into a discussion question about what happens to assistance to countries, the governments of whom don't necessarily want that assistance. But let's hold that off until a little bit later. There is no possible assistance program without engaging in a changed policy, procedure, structure of the recipient country, because that's what development is about. So and none of this work, none of the assistance work is imposed on the recipient countries. These are not programs that are imposed by the donors. They are, whether reluctant or not, accepted by the governments of the country. And also, let's reserve maybe for discussion, there's a document that was written in 2005 that the donors and the recipients negotiated called the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness. And it talks about country ownership. What it leaves blank, or what it merges, is the identity, in my opinion wrong, of the country and the government. When they say country ownership, they tend to mean run the government's decision about what is best for the country. And that might be okay in a democratic government, but I'm not so sure it's okay in a government that's not democratic. How do you know what that government stands for relative to the interests of the country as a whole? Again, let's hold that off maybe for our discussion. But the purpose of assistance, I think, or at least a concomitant of it, is to change the political, economic, health, educational, environmental policies and procedures of the countries that you're hoping to help get to a better place than they are now. So it's not imposed, it's inherent in assistance, and the Westphalian principles, I think, are still around, still important, but eroded. Third question, aren't we hypocritical in the way we do this? And to me, although I admit I think I may be in a minority on this in the democracy promotion world, I think there is some, first of all. But the second is that, to me, I don't take and this is just me, I don't take a purist view either on democracy and governance. It is, as I said when I first started, I think, one of our interests. It's not the only one of our interests. We have a multiplicity of interests as a country. The fact that this is one of them, it seems to me, doesn't make us more hypocritical, or doesn't make us hypocritical because in some given instance, other of our interests take precedence, any more than it is hypocritical to say we have an interest in, let's say, privacy, and we also have an interest in security. So 2 or 3 days ago, the Supreme Court of the United States held that a local police department has the right to search your cell phone if you are stopped. And the argument was they shouldn't have that right unless there is probable cause, this is the side that lost, that you are a security risk. And the court said, we can't second guess, maybe wrongly, maybe rightly, lots of people differ about how the court rules on any given case, but the court said, look, we have two separate values that we have here. One is security, the other is privacy. We don't doubt that they're both values, but they have to be traded off against one another. At what point do you sacrifice your privacy for security? And one point, I can tell you, is when you enter an airport, when you want to get on an airplane. You are basically told, take your belt off, take your shoes off, empty your pockets. I mean, they virtually, make you undress to get through onto a plane. And we say, okay, fine, that is the cost of security, the privacy cost of security, at least in that environment. And there are always balances between interests of privacy, interests in security. But that's only one example. Freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, the right to bear arms. All of these questions come up all of the time, and the court is constantly having to balance between different values in different circumstances. And so it seems to me we are as a country as well. Second, I don't know that I would have made the decision, I don't think I would have made the decision that the government made on Hamas. But I think it's not required that the donor provide assistance to any country that wants it. We also have the right, I think, to reserve to ourselves what countries and what policies do we want to support and what do we not. And the fact that we don't want to support a particular democracy, support it, doesn't necessarily, I think, make us hypocritical to say we think it still should be democratic. The question is, when do we support a democratic transition? And that may involve a whole variety of other interests than just the democracy one. At least that's my view. Other people disagree with it, and so they believe we are hypocritical when we do that. And I admit that there is a certain amount of validity, a certain amount of credence to that argument. Finally, and most difficultly maybe, are we effective at doing this? I mean, are we getting anywhere? We have some data on it, some statistical data, some qualitative data, some quantitative data. And to me, that is the hardest of the 4 questions. We have had some successes. You can point, of course, to Central Europe and the 1990s. But I don't think you could say that that was due to our assistance. I think you could say, perhaps, that we helped these countries transform after they became more democratic. There's an argument to be had for that, certainly. I think it's harder to see where assistance has actually produced a transformation. We will see what the changes in the Arab world are. I think the story is as yet not told. Tunisia looks pretty good. Libya looks not so good. Egypt is hanging in the balance, and I'm not so sure which way it will go. But I think certainly our partners, the ones who get money to do this kind of thing, are quick to say that they think they played an important part in these transformations. I think the evidence is out on that. It's a little bit stronger once the transformations take place and trying to help these countries put into effect the objectives that they say they want to achieve. The rule of law, good governance, elections, parties, and so on. But last, I guess I would ask you, those are the four, I would ask you to ask this question. What would you like this country to stand for? If it doesn't stand for freedom, if it doesn't stand at least in part for democracy, if it doesn't stand for equality, if it doesn't stand for the rule of law, what are we about? What's our country about? What are we doing abroad? What's the purpose of our assistance? What are we trying to achieve? And perhaps to go back to that map that I talked about earlier, what kind of a world do we want to live in? I want to live in a world of free democracies with free markets, better lives for their people, less poverty, less disease, and a greater sense in which people have a sense over their own dignity and their own political futures and their own economic futures. And that's, in part, what the Democracy and Governance Promotion Assistance is about. Thank you.
Okay, so, sorry, we'll go ahead and get started with the question and answer. Please wait for the microphone so your question can be recorded on our podcast that we'll put up on the internet. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and wait for the mic, please.
No questions. No disagreements. Wow.
Hi, my question is about, since you worked in USA, just not necessarily specifically democracy and governments, but just that kind of whole thing in general, do you feel like it's effective at creating a better image of the United States? And does that help with reducing terrorists and other people that dislike the United States?
Should I do these one at a time?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so there's three different sort of bundles in there. One is the U.S. image, a second is terrorism, and the third is sort of the group of things that all sort of come together. I suppose it improves the U.S. image, at least that's the belief, because some years ago Congress passed, I don't remember if it was a law or certainly made its views clear that, you know what a CODEL is? It's a congressional delegation. So some congressional delegations, staff members and Congress members of Congress, went abroad and they were shown projects that USAID was doing, and they asked people about it, and nobody knew that it was the USAID that was doing it, or the U.S. government, or the American people. And they got pretty upset about it, and they said, listen, people need to know that this is coming from the U.S. government precisely because of anti-Americanism and so on. And so they said, look, from now on, we want everything that the U.S. government does, or everything certainly USAID does, and actually other branches as well, to be branded with a thing that makes it clear that it's coming from the U.S. And so USAID developed a brand, or had one actually, that it resurrected, and now it's on everything. So, and I would say maybe not always in the best way. So, for example, some equipment, it's usually on equipment, obviously, because it's hard to brand, people's ideas, branded by the USAID. So you go into things like sometimes, not so much in the democracy area, but material equipment has been provided to some people, to some groups, and so you go into a courtroom and there's a judge, a Tunisian judge, let's say, and right at the front it says, brought to you by the American people. So you want to say, well, whoa, that may not be the way we want to convey this exactly, or similar, we give something to a parliament and it gets plastered, everybody's desk gets plastered, brought to you by the American people. So the television hones in on these people, and it looks as though the parliament of Pakistan has been brought to you by the American people, not necessarily a thing you would like to have happen, either as a Pakistani or as an American, I might say. So some people believe, certainly, that it is helping the U.S. image, that it's softening some of our other interests by including an assistance package in it. And that may be one of the reasons that assistance is now part of the national security strategy over a Democratic and a Republican administration. But I think it would be a little cynical to say that. I think that's certainly one reason. But I don't honestly think it's the driving one. I think the driving one is really an honest desire to make the world a better place, to improve conditions, or to put it in the proper lexicon, to assist other people to make their lives better. So I think that's the reason, more than just as a propaganda device to soften the image of the United States, although that's there. I personally, this is my personal opinion, doubt that assistance is going to diminish terrorism. The reasons people are terrorists are complicated, and I don't think they're primarily actually a function primarily of poverty. Poverty plays into it, but I think if you look at who the terrorists actually are and the networks of terrorism, they're by and large they're not some poor peasant in some little remote village. As you saw when Osama bin Laden was captured, he wasn't living in a hut or a cave. And their communication networks are quite substantial and so on. So I personally, and I want to emphasize this personal opinion here, if I had to say where the terrorist threat is coming from and where to look for terrorist cells, I would not look in the hinterlands of Yemen primarily, or Afghanistan, or Somalia. I would look in Berlin and in Munich and Frankfurt, which after all is where those planes, where you can disappear into those places. You have all of the infrastructure necessary to create a really good, kind of conspiracy. You have the ability to buy the weapons you need. You have the ability to sneak them on board. You have the ability to deliver them, all of which I can tell you, because I've been there, is not very easy in Paktia province of Afghanistan. So if I were looking, first of all, I wouldn't look to these places as the primary origin of the immediate threat. Nor do I think that necessarily, if you ask terrorists themselves, and people do, what their motives are, that they're primarily motivated by development issues. They're primarily motivated by other kinds of things. Does that mean that it would reduce terrorism if their countries were more developed, more secure, had better governance, had better economies, et cetera? I think the answer to that is probably yes. But it's a pretty circuitous route, I think. And you would have to do this in so many places with so much money and so little certainty of success that if I were doing an anti-terrorist program, I think development isn't the shortest distance between the White House and where you want to be. But that's my view. Other people disagree with that.
How is U.S. aid involved in Iraq since 2003 and since the pullout last year? In
Since the
helping
pullout?
development, yeah, improving the economic situation.
Iraq and Afghanistan are both cases. I'm glad that you raised them. Let me do a digression and come back to the 2003 post. It is often said, wrongly I believe, that we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan because of democracy. I think that's just flat out factually not right. The closest example to that is Iraq, in which the Bush administration was very clear that the casus belli was weapons of mass destruction, and what the president called a grave and gathering threat. That's a quote. Against the United States by Iraq in weapons of mass destruction. And there was a UN mission to look at this and to try to hold Saddam Hussein responsible for his commitment to reducing or eliminating, actually, weapons of mass destruction, which undoubtedly he had had. He claimed he got rid of them. He did not, however, let the inspectors in everywhere. The inspectors were uncertain because they hadn't been able to inspect everywhere. The intelligence services came to the conclusion that he had weapons of mass destruction. He was given an opportunity to let the UNISOM inspectors in. He didn't do it for reasons that I'm sure he regretted later, certainly when he was in that hole. But that was the reason. It turned out wrongly for the war. After there were no weapons, it was clear that there were no immediate weapons of mass destruction ready for delivery. The administration scrambled for alternative explanations, among which were violence in the neighborhood, terrorism against its people, threats against its neighbors, etc. And, as the Deputy Secretary of Defense famously said, democracy was the only one we could agree on, along with these other threats. It was a rationalization after the fact. And unfortunately, it stuck in a lot of popular minds that the reason we went there was to promote democracy in Iraq, rather than the weapons of mass destruction. Similarly, I think it's fair to say that whatever the assistance programs and the anti-terrorism programs and the anti-insurgency programs in Afghanistan that were later developed, which did include democracy and governance elements, we did not attack Afghanistan because we wanted to create, as people are wont to say, a Jeffersonian democracy in Afghanistan. First, I don't know anybody who was involved in Afghanistan affairs afterwards that ever thought, ever, in their wildest imagination, that this country was in any near term going to be anything like a Jeffersonian democracy. You'd have to be delusional to the point of you should be incarcerated, should be put into some kind of institution to think that you're going to create a Jeffersonian democracy 10 years in Afghanistan. So the reason we went there was Al-Qaeda, pure and simple. Now, what happened afterwards in those countries is a whole other matter. Afterwards, as the then Secretary of State, former General Powell said, you break it, you buy it. Or you break it, you own it, I think is the way he put it. And so what were we going to do after the attack and after the occupation? And that has been a major source of dispute within the government. Should we, as the Vice President in this administration says, be anti-terrorist, or should we be anti-insurgent? Very different questions. Anti-insurgency is a much, much bigger, much longer, much more difficult program to try to achieve in a country than picking out the terrorists would be. But the U.S. did pursue or has been pursuing an anti-insurgency strategy in Afghanistan. And similarly, in Iraq. after 2003 and the military withdrawal from Iraq, you were left with only civilians in whatever was going to be provided by the U.S. government to Iraq. And that was an assistance program to try to develop Iraq in these many different dimensions: health, electricity, water, education, economic growth, resource extraction, and governance. So after 2003, before 2003, it was a joint civilian and military exercise to do these things, with, I would say, the predominance actually of the military. After 2003, or actually after 2011, after we really withdrew, it has become a civilian-only program. So after 2003, the question was, what kind of Iraq were you going to be left with? And that became a development program jointly operated by the military and the civilians, with all of these programs, including the democracy program, supported by the military as well as the civilians. The military had its own rule of law programs. It had its own governance programs, quite apart from those of the civilian assistance programs. You can discuss whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it was a joint, 2003 onward, a joint program to develop Iraq. And it had all these elements in it. I'm not sure that answers your question about what happened after 2003. I think it's a fair question to ask is, what has any of this been successful, as I said initially? I think that's the harder question to answer, but it was part of the civilian and the military program in Iraq after 2003 and still remains after 2011.
All right, I think we're going to take one more question.
My name is Grady Baker. I'm an economics major. In light of the unrest in the Middle East, things like the Arab Spring, Israel-Palestine relations, Syria, and the Afghanistan war and Iraq war, in your opinion, is democracy an integral and a necessary part of peace in that region?
The short answer is no, which is why the hypocrisy question came up with regard, for example, to Mubarak, who, though autocratic, signed a peace agreement with Israel. And the argument has been, and probably even the Israelis would make it, that we're better off, there is greater chance of peace with an autocratic government like Mubarak making peace with Israel than there is with a democratic government in Egypt, because a democratic government in Egypt is likely to have at least a major, if not a majority, of anti-Israeli, but more importantly, perhaps sort of an Islamic color to what kind of democracy Egypt will have. Whereas the military did not. Military had no domestic campaign for Islam. If anything, it was opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood and prevented it from organizing. I mean, it wasn't just the U.S. that was worried about the Muslim Brotherhood. The military was worried about it, and the Mubarak regime was worried about it. I guess the question is, what kind of a peace do you have in the Middle East? It's a difficult question, I gotta say. And at best, you have a cold peace in which officially there's not going to be a war. Officially, there is a peace agreement. But there's not a real feeling, I mean, I wouldn't confuse the relationships between Egyptians and Israelis with the relationships between Canadians and Americans. And the reason has to do with, I think, how the political systems play out. So in the long run, in the long term, will you be able to have a durable, true peace in the Middle East without popular sovereignty? It seems to me you could limp along as we have, but I think it's going to be difficult to get a true peace without a coming to terms of these communities, of these populations with one another. And so over the long term, I would say, I don't think so. But if you're at the State Department, you're not worried about the long term. You got enough to worry about this week and maybe next week. So the long term is Memorial Day, 2012. And that's a little stark, I think, because people do plan for a much longer world. But by and large, it creates a lot of problems. It will create a lot of problems to have a democratic Egypt. Over the longer term, I think you won't be able to get a real peace without a stable, popular government with an end to the kind of poverty and inequality and educational problems that have plagued Egypt for decades. If that doesn't change, it seems to me you're constantly sitting on a potential for instability and who knows what kind of government to come afterwards. But if I were at state, I too would worry about what the price in the short term will be for that longer term vision, which may itself not turn out right.